Okay, now I think.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me. If not, then please send a note in the group chat. But for those of you who can hear me, welcome to the King's Russia Institute online, our second online edition. We started this last week at the same time, same date with Grigory Asmolov from our own King's Russia Institute, talking about crisis communication in Russia and beyond. We are continuing the COVID-19 theme this evening with really some rapid research from two speakers. So we're very grateful to have with us this evening Marlene Laruelle, who is director of the program on new approaches to research and security in Eurasia at the Elliott School for International Affairs at George Washington University, and is joining us from Washington, if I'm not mistaken, and Madeline McCann, who works at the same program at the same school at George Washington, is a recent graduate of the MA program in Russian Studies at Indiana University, and a recent intern at the Bellona Foundation in Russia. They'll be presenting research behind their recent HONAR's policy memo on regime responses to COVID-19 throughout the post-Soviet space, and the impact that the pandemic is having on structures of power in the region. Before I hand over, just a couple of announcements. I had a slide up a minute ago for those of you who saw it with the ground rules, but I'll repeat it here. Rule number one is I would ask everybody to keep their microphones off while other people are speaking. That way we minimize echo and minimize noise on the line. Also, keep your video off in order to maximize bandwidth for everybody and improve the virtual experience here. The session is being recorded, so please do bear that in mind when and if you decide to participate in the conversation towards the end. If you do have a question or a comment you'd like to make, please use the chat function to send me a note or type an asterisk or something to virtually raise your hand so that I know you're interested, and I'll call on everybody in turn. The session is as it usually is when we meet in person in London, and that we've got a presentation of about 30 to 40 minutes, followed by Q&A for really as long as it goes. As I said, this is recorded, and we will make it publicly available afterwards if you want to recap any of the conversation. Having said that, Madeline, are you ready to go?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Well, I'm going to hand over to you, and I understand, Madeline, you'll be kicking us off. Yep.
Yeah. So I'll get started. So thank you to all of you for logging in and coming to hear some about the research that we've been doing, and we're looking forward to hearing your comments and the discussion after this. So it's becoming increasingly clear that this pandemic is not only a medical and social issue, but also a political and geopolitical one. So I'm going to start out by talking about some of the state responses to the pandemic, focusing primarily on the speed, scope, and quality of those state responses across Eurasia. And then I'll turn to Marlene, who's going to discuss some more of the long-term political implications of those responses. So an important note before I get into the data is that a lot of the data that we're working with is by and large very unreliable right now. So most of it is anecdotal. There's a lot of uncertainty about coronavirus cases, both because of poor testing capacities, but also because a lot of coronavirus testing right now is unreliable. Many of the countries that we're studying have historically not been very transparent in the face of crises. And there are increasing media restrictions around what can be reported about the coronavirus outbreak in many of these countries. But one thing we do know is that in many of the countries across the Eurasian region, there are extremely high risks. China is a major trading partner for most of them. Many of them share borders with China or Iran, which were two major hotspots early in the outbreak. Many of them have deep links with Europe, as well as high levels of domestic mobility. And so by and large, many of the countries that we're looking at are at extremely high risk during this outbreak. So the full extent and spread of the virus and the quality of state responses is difficult to reconstruct, but we've attempted to do so by looking and focusing on a few very specific and measurable indicators in particular. So for example, is there info about existing cases in general? To what extent have regimes worked to actively provide information and inform their citizens about proper ways to respond to the situation? Have there been limitations imposed on domestic and international movements for citizens? Has the regime encouraged or required social distancing measures? And have they discussed or promised any sort of financial efforts to mitigate the impacts of the crisis on populations and their economies? So in our analysis, we've divided countries up into three primary categories, into the early responders, the late responders, and the deniers of the crisis. So to begin with, we found that Georgia and Armenia were two of the earliest responders to the crisis. They very quickly acknowledged that they were at very high risk and began taking active measures in late February and early March to prevent the spread of the virus. So this included closing down schools very early in March and rapidly working to create platforms to distribute information to their populations about the pandemic. They've also discussed and promised various economic stimulus plans to support their economies. And these were discussed in particular in early March. In our late responders category, we have included Azerbaijan, Moldova, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan. We found that these countries, for a variety of reasons, waited a little bit longer to take active measures to respond to the threat. Azerbaijan lagged a little bit behind Georgia and Armenia in imposing limitations on its borders, banning public events, and creating an information portal for citizens to gain access to information about the pandemic. Moldova, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan mostly followed broader coronavirus containment decisions across Europe, closing and imposing nationwide quarantines around mid-March. And Kyrgyzstan was a little bit slower to follow suit, but also ultimately followed suit around mid-March. And then the third category that we have is those that have essentially denied the severity of the pandemic and refused to take active measures against it. So in this category of deniers, we have Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Belarus. So both Turkmenistan and Tajikistan are at extremely high risk, but have yet to recognize or officially confirm any cases of coronavirus in their territories. This is despite some media reports to the contrary. Unlike most other Central Asian states, neither Turkmenistan nor Tajikistan canceled the official celebration of the Nowruz holiday. So while in many other countries people were being encouraged to social distance, thousands of people were gathered together towards the end of March to celebrate the holiday in Tajikistan and Turkmenistan. And in Belarus, while the existence of the virus hasn't been denied, it has been consistently minimized and downplayed at the official level. So public spaces and educational institutions still haven't been closed. The Belarusian Premier League is the only soccer league in Europe that continues to play without restrictions. And authorities in Belarus have denounced surrounding countries, particularly Russia, for closing their borders in response to the crisis. So in place of the generally recommended measures for containing the spread of the virus, leaders in these countries have suggested a variety of other remedies. For example, in Turkmenistan, the president has encouraged the use of a traditional medicinal plant to fumigate homes, while in Belarus, the president suggested that the problem could be alleviated if people got back out to working in the fields. And he also facetiously suggested that 50 grams of vodka could be used to combat the virus. These are just a couple of indicators which suggest the lack of seriousness with which the countries in this third category are treating the pandemic. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about Russia, which has been a hybrid in its response in some ways to the coronavirus outbreak. In many ways, it acted as an early responder, but in some ways, it acted as a late responder. So it was quick to close borders with China and introduce quarantine for newcomers, but wasn't really limiting movement inside the country until recently. For example, when Moscow went on lockdown on March 30th, it's bragged about its relatively high testing capacity, but there have been many doubts as to the reliability of this testing. There have been large publicity stunts, such as sending aid to both Italy and the United States, but it's not at all clear, especially across Russia's regions, that there is the healthcare infrastructure necessary to deal with a potential surge in cases. And Russia is very distinctive in that a lot of the onus for responding to the crisis has been devolved to the regional level rather than the federal level. So we're seeing a situation where some leaders, such as the mayor of Moscow, Sergei Sobyanin, have emerged as particularly proactive in response to the crisis. But we can expect to see strong differentials in capacity across the country and across the different regions of the country, which will react and respond to the virus with different speeds and different levels of effectiveness. So now I'll hand things over to Marlene, who's going to talk a little bit more about the political implications of these different measures.
Yeah, thank you so much, Madeleine. Thank you, Sam, for having us here. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. So I will follow up on the discussion after Madeleine and discuss several of the more kind of theoretical points or elements of understanding how it could impact the different political regimes in the region. But before that, I would like to do make two broad overall points. The first one is that we are just at the beginning of the pandemics, and until there will be a vaccine, there will be new waves of pandemics. So what we are studying now is the first wave, but it means that probably states that haven't been very highly touched by the virus can be really hurt in a second wave in the fall or early next year until a vaccine is there. So we are just at the beginning of the pandemics, which means we are also just at the beginning of the research. The second point that I think is even more important is that I don't think there is any uniqueness in studying what is happening in the former Soviet space and how states are responding to the crisis. I think this pandemic is really revealing systemic structural weaknesses globally in the world in terms of disaster preparedness and healthcare system. And many states with a very good governance system have been recording a lot of failures in Western Europe, in the US also. So I think we should be trying to always put what we are discussing for the former Soviet space into a broader context. And except the three states that are really in a denier position that Madeleine just mentioned, the other post-Soviet states haven't been doing really worse than many countries in the West. They may have lower state capacity, they may have lack of transparency in terms of discussing information, but the way they deal with this kind of unexpected event in destructuring their system is not structurally, I think, different from what is happening in many Western countries. So the main issue we were trying to look at in our paper, and as I said, it's a very preliminary one, is to see if these pandemics is in fact changing the hybrid nature of regimes, with it push to kind of break in a kind of authoritarian mechanism, or on the contrary, will that be reinforcing authoritarian tendencies in the region? And so I will be discussing several of these elements. In terms of looking at the pandemics as weakening the regimes, I think depending how we want to interpret what is happening, we can get different perspectives. The first element I would like to mention is this kind of tension between the Soviet legacy of state secrecy regarding natural and industrial disaster on one side, and the need for transparency on the other side. And you can see tensions about these two elements all over the region. we are at a time of social media and people are able to gather a lot of anecdotal evidences about what is happening in their own country or in their own cities. So we know, for example, that the population in Tajikistan, in Kyrgyzstan before they decided for merger, or in Belarus, is very skeptical about the state narrative about nothing is happening, there is no really crisis. So you can see that the state secrecy tradition is getting challenged by the way people can interact and get their news and realize what is happening on the ground. So I think it's really an issue that was already discussed last week with Grisha about crisis communication and how every state, every regimes will be able to manage the way they communicate about what is happening and the way they build the response. And I think there will be a kind of scale of trust toward the regimes that we will see emerging. It's very clear, for example, that in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, the population is quite distrustful toward the regimes and therefore doesn't really buy the state narrative about everything is going pretty well, even if the Kyrgyz narrative slightly evolved recently. In Russia, that's interesting to see that the way the crisis communication has been managed, because Putin, by definition, wants only to bring good news, not bad news. So he delegates the first level of the first round of discussion about the crisis to his team. But recently, he has been more active. And you can see that until Putin said there is a crisis in the country, the crisis is not really perceived necessarily as on the ground by people. So I think there will be an interesting kind of evolution on crisis communication and on these tensions between the need for transparency and people able to collect their own data and this kind of tradition of being very careful in revealing what is really happening in the country. But some states did pretty well. Kazakhstan, which is a quite authoritarian state, has been relatively transparent on what was happening on the ground quite rapidly. And I know people from Kazakhstan were relatively positive about the way the government has been transparent about things happening on the ground. The second element I wanted to mention is the concrete ability of state structure to deal with the disaster. And here also we have a lot of literature, huge literature about how crisis management and management of natural and industrial disaster may impact the legitimacy of state structure in the post-Soviet or the post-communist world. We have, of course, literature on the impact of Chernobyl, but we have a lot of literature of the 2010 forest fires in Moscow and how they contribute to decredibilize the way the state was able to answer. We have the 2018 Kemeryevo mall fire that also impacted the way citizens were looking at the ability of their government to react. What will be different here is that the pandemic is not an industrial or natural disaster. The main institution in charge will not be the Ministry of Emergency Situation. It has to be the healthcare system, which is a much more complex object to study and much more complex object for the state to try to help to build a reaction. So what I think will be really interesting is to follow, especially in Russia, how the people will react to the way the healthcare system can manage the crisis, because we know that since the 2018 pension reform, there have been a collapse of rating in approval of the government because of the pension crisis. There is a lot of discussion going on about the healthcare system, the privatization of the healthcare system. So it's already a very sensitive question in Russia. And of course, the pandemics will add one more layer in making this the relationship, the way the state is providing public services will become really a critical element on the state legitimacy. But what I think is the main element in terms of weakening the regimes as they are now, it's not the pandemic itself, it's the global recession that is coming with it. It's really the economic impact that is following. All these states are based on redistribution of rent. And so it's a key element of stability. It's a key element in the kind of living standards of the population. And so if suddenly there is an important reduction of state budget, that will probably, on one way or another, in some states have a political impact. The less regimes are generous, the more they will be subject to some dissatisfaction. But here also, as I said, I don't think there is any specificity to the region. If you look at what is happening in Europe and in the US, you can already see how the global recession will have an impact probably on the electoral attitudes of many citizens, and there will be regime change on one way or another also in the West. If we look at the way this pandemic is, on the contrary, consolidating the authoritarian tendency of the regime, there I think we have even much more data to work with. The first one, and here also it's a global feature, I think there is now this feeling of everybody can be vulnerable. So this kind of ontological, existential insecurity. And we know that in this kind of insecurity time, people are more ready to give up on their institutional freedom. We have a lot of surveys already done in Europe showing how much people are ready to give up some of their public liberty in exchange for hoping that the state can manage and preserve their health. And so probably that will also contribute to reinforcing authoritarian tendency in the post-Soviet region. So it will, I think, all the field of biopower, biopolitics, is really one of the promising field of discussion for our region and globally for the world. Another element that is also largely discussed is that there is a risk of making the kind of state of emergency a permanent feature of some of the regimes. We have several other cases also outside of our region to look at. Hungary with Orban getting full powers, Israel with Netanyahu being able to build a government of national unity, a lot of debates in Western Europe about this state of emergency and the way even democratic states could try to use that as a way to control their own population. And we know previously with terrorism that in moment of crisis, state structure tend naturally, even when they are democratic, to kind of increase their power control over the population. So this is a trend that probably will be visible also in Eurasia. Another important element, which may be more small scale, but will still be important for citizens on the ground, is that the pandemic is paralyzing citizenry in a sense, because there will be no more protest or even public gathering for sanitary reasons for several months. And we could imagine several of these regimes maintaining this ban on kind of public collective gathering for several months. There is also this narrative about in a moment of national unity crisis, you don't want any critique to emerge. Everybody who will be criticizing the way the government is managing the crisis will be a kind of be positioned as the unpatriotic person. So here also we see that emerging in the post-Soviet space, but we also see it in Europe also. So here, as I said, I think it's a global trend. And then, which maybe the key element or the most discussed, is that this pandemic is accelerating the use of digital tools to control the population. So a kind of big brotherization happening all over the globes. And we know that many of the post-Soviet states were already interested in looking at that technologies a few years before, and now that, of course, suddenly make the need for this kind of technology much more legitimate. So we have the Chinese model of mass surveillance, which is probably not easily replicable at that scale outside of China, but we have the use of cell phone to do contact tracing. We have the use of artificial intelligence and everything related to the smartization of cities that will be probably impacting on public and individual liberties. We see it already in the discussion on the way the Moscow municipality has been using facial recognition. It's also, as I said, largely discussed in Western countries. Italy has been using this contact tracing mechanism. So here you see that the relationship of the post-Soviet space also to China, the fact that China is both at the origin of the virus, sending medical aid and branding its own model as a solution, and the country selling all these technologies, make that the relationship to China is really a critical one for all the state of the post-Soviet region. And then the last point I wanted to mention is that there are elements of a broader picture on how the pandemic is kind of shifting geopolitics and the kind of tectonic of international relations now. The first element I would like to mention is that this kind of generalized crisis of federalism. We see that in the US, for example, it's not the federal state that is taking decision, it's done at the level of the state. In the European Union, it's nation states who are taking decision. Brussels is quite absent. And in Russia, we have this really fascinating phenomenon of a kind of federalization, suddenly, or regionalization. So it's here again, it's not the federal center taking the majority of decision. It's left to the regional governor to decide how they want to manage the crisis. So that will be really interesting to follow in the long run, how this regionalization will impact the long-term kind of center-region relationship in Russia. But here also, what is happening in Russia is part of a global phenomenon where this kind of federal structure seems to be failing in providing quick answer. The second element related to that is that the pandemic is really understood as a kind of illness born from globalization. It happened because we live in a world that is globalized, and the recession that is coming from the pandemics is also very much related to the fact that we live in globalized economies now. So what we have been seeing is this kind of return of the nation state. Suddenly borders matter. Suddenly it's the nation, the states that are taking decision, even if they are part of bigger structure like the European Union or, of course, the Eurasian Economic Union. So all that is, in a sense, validating the narratives of the Russian authority on saying that all multilateral supranational institutions are, in fact, window dressing. What really matters is nation state self-interest. And when things are when a state feels in danger, it will act as a state defending its own border and its own nation, and any kind of international cooperation will stop. So that will be reinforcing the Russian narrative. And when we look on the ground at what is happening with the Eurasian Economic Union, or even the union with Belarus, it's exactly the same as for the European Union, is that everybody is on its own. There is no more union working at home. Each state is managing its own crisis, closing its own border, trying to defend its own citizen, and not taking care of the others. So that here also, what is happening in Eurasia is quite similar to what is happening in Europe, with also another phenomenon linked to that we will probably see emerging. We already see it in Europe. It will probably also be visible in some countries of the post-Soviet region, the rise of xenophobia, the fear of the others being now also the one able to carry the illness and bring the virus at home. So there will be here also probably long-term political consequences on the fear of the others and how it will be translated politically. And then last point into this kind of broad discussion is the debate that we see all over the media now about democratic and authoritarian regime and the way they are managing the crisis, with this kind of slightly biased, I think, narrative that authoritarian regimes are managing the crisis better. If you look in details, which kind of authoritarian regimes are managing the crisis better, the only case that is provided is China. And I think we should be very careful on the way we think China has been managing the crisis, because we don't really have a lot of information. They probably lied on the number of people infected and people who died. If we look at other authoritarian countries like Iran, cannot say Iran has been managing well the crisis. So what I think is really the nature of the debates, it's not so much the opposition between supposed so-called democratic and so-called authoritarian regime. It's more about the nature of the social contract and the way the population is ready to be compliant to state orders. And here the division we see is between, on one side, let's say, European countries, and on the other side, some Asian country like South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore. I mean, Singapore is a quite authoritarian country, not at the level of China, but South Korea and Taiwan are democracy. So I don't think the point, as I said, is about the nature of the regime. It's about the nature of the social contract. The point is that, do we have enough trust in a government to have the society accepting to comply to government order and in a kind of voluntary manner? And I think we see the success of some of these Asian countries, and we see, on the contrary, in Europe, the difficulties for liberal regimes to impose restriction, to enforce measure on, and how people can see their function, the society is functioning on a more kind of individualistic element. And therefore, it's very difficult for democratic liberal state, Western European style, to enforce the decision and to become repressive when the decisions are not respected. So some brief conclusion before opening the floor for question. I think we see more elements that push in the direction of making the regimes more authoritarian, that will consolidate a lot of authoritarian aspects that all this hybrid regime already have. And I don't think that it's really weakening the regimes, except if we would have a case, which we don't have so far, for example, a huge mismanagement in one of the countries of the region with a very deadly results of the pandemics. And in that case, that would really weaken the regime. What we can see, and I think that's probably what will be happening in Russia, is that the crisis will just be one more element added to an already long list of elements of kind of tension, of mistrust growing between some element of the societies and the state structure, especially at the federal level. So I think the crisis just will add one element more of weakening the Putin regime, but it will not make it collapsing. What will be probably the most interesting element to follow for Russia will be this federalization or regionalization aspect, to see how on the long term it can, in a sense, reshape or not the global relationship between Moscow and the region. But what we see globally for the world region is that suddenly they have, at the practical level, they have the tool of control to implement higher control on the society in terms of using cell phone technologies, smart cities technology. So suddenly these practical tools are not only available, but they become legitimate and largely supported by public opinion. At the ideological level, we have this narrative about globalization is in fact risky, and sometimes nation state and border and closure and protectionisms are positive and help preserving the nation. And then what I think we will be also seeing growing, and especially will be important for Russia and maybe also for Ukraine, is the crisis of aspirational model, right? Is that the West has been largely underperforming. If you compare state capacity in managing the crisis and the wealth of the country, then the West has been largely mismanaging the crisis for all the wealth and the state capability it should have had in terms of preventing the disaster, having a functional healthcare system. So it's probably a moment where for many liberal forces in Russia, in Ukraine, and all over the region, it will be difficult to look at the West as being a successful model. And it's not the first time that the West or Europe is seen as failing in terms of providing this kind of essential support to the population. There was the migration crisis. Now there is this pandemic crisis. So there will be probably growing narratives by some of the local elites about the fact that it's Asia cultural, so-called cultural compliance and respect for state order that seems to be working more for ontological security than the liberal Western model, and that will just bring more water to the general narrative we see in the region, in Russia, but not only, about the West and liberalism is failing in protecting citizen and providing the kind of basic support to the nation. The liberalism as being dysfunctional and efficient. So I think that would be in the kind of the political or ideological discussion in the region, that will be a key element that we will see growing. And maybe I will stop here and let time for more questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Marlene. Thank you, Madeline, for the introduction. It's a lot of work that you guys put in a very short amount of time to survey the region. And we're quite grateful for that. Got a number of people who have already signaled some questions they'd like to ask. I don't know whether you want me to read these out loud or whether you want to read them yourself, but I've got Ian Bond first on the list. Ian, do you want to turn on your microphone, or shall I read this?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah, really interesting presentations. I wanted to ask about this question of xenophobia and what impact that might have on relations between countries of the former Soviet Union and China. Putin obviously has set great store in his great relationship with Xi Jinping, but as you pointed out, Russia was very quick to close its borders with China. And then you've got the Central Asians, for whom China is certainly their most important economic partner now. I mean, is there any of the narrative that you're seeing, for example, with Trump in the US, of saying, well, this is the Wuhan virus, this is the China virus, and we should sort of pull up the drawbridge against China?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we need to dissociate two levels. At the state level, you don't see anything critical toward China. On the contrary, you see kind of a state narrative showing China as the model who has been succeeding in controlling the virus, in helping disseminating medical aid, in potentially helping selling all these technological tools for control. So that the state level, I think both in Russia and in Central Asia. When you look more at the public opinion level, then of course you see differences. You see there have been several cases of xenophobia against Chinese people in Russia and in Central Asia, and we had them also in Western Europe. So here also, I don't think there is any specificity of suddenly people being afraid when they see someone they identified as Chinese in the street. So this kind of very basic everyday xenophobia is happening, and there are narratives in social media about all that is coming from China. It's because China is I don't know, dirty, unable to manage its own health, its own population. So I think there will be a growing gap between the state narrative and the kind of public opinion narrative. But I think these countries are used to manage this gap because they already had a pretty low vision, negative vision among their public opinion of China and still having pro-Chinese foreign policy. So I think they will be able to manage the gap, even if, of course, it's a difficult schizophrenic exercise to be doing, but they don't really care about their public opinion globally, so they can manage.
Great. Should say Ian Bond from the CER here in London. If I can ask people just to introduce themselves as they ask their questions, that would be great. I've got Quinn Scribner next.
Hello, my name's Quintin. I'm at King's Russia Institute, also working with Chatham House at the moment. My question relates to Russia's economic response. I'm curious how you view the recently announced economic measures, subsidized loans, deferred payments, and some targeted support towards large businesses. I guess, what do you think will be the impact on private enterprise? And how does this compare to what's going on in other former Soviet states? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Madeline, do you want to say something, or I can also? Yeah. We don't have your mic. Your mic.
Your mic's off, Madeline.
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I haven't focused very much in particular on the economic impacts, but from what I've read and seen so far, it looks like the in regards to the recently announced economic policies, there's a huge lack of clarity about how those will actually be rolled out and how they will actually be implemented. And so I don't know specifically, other than that there's still a huge lack of clarity on how that's actually going to impact people in the private sector.
I think many of the measures that have been taken, or at least announced, are kind of copy-paste of things that have been done by many European countries. But here also will be interesting to see if they can really put them in practice, because all that will cost a lot of money to everybody. And so the point is how state budget will be able to support that. And once again, I think what is happening in Russia is not quite different from what is happening in Europe. It will be very difficult for European countries also to pay for everything. They promise that will probably be the same for Russia. And of course, the poorer the state, the more difficult it will be. I mean, you can imagine that in Central Asia, for example, or in Moldova, or in the South Caucasus, it would be very difficult for state structure to provide enough support for small private entrepreneurs. And so there are already a huge group of population who cannot work since mid-March. And you are in countries that have largely informal economies, which means that money is still, payments are still done in cash. It's very difficult to prove you work, very difficult to prove how much you are making a month. So it will be very difficult to have state structure helping for that, which will probably create a kind of, at least for Central Asia, a kind of labor migration, new waves. Once, of course, it will be very clear that the state cannot help improve the economic standard of the population. And depending how many months it will continue, you can imagine the long-term impact for informal economies will be in fact higher than for more formal economies.
I want to come in on that, actually, on the back of Quintin's question on Russia specifically, right? Because the Kremlin, as he says, has begun to do some things that look and feel a bit more like what we've seen here in the UK or elsewhere in Europe in terms of support for enterprises across the economy. But they came in, at least initially, for quite a bit of criticism, right, in the way that they rolled this out, right? In that they have announced this as a holiday with pay, right, which puts the onus really squarely on business to keep people fed and keep people employed, rather than to roll that out together with a set of subsidies or relief that would make that possible. And while it's true that this is going to be expensive for Russia and for everybody else, the reality is that Russia is in a fairly good fiscal position. The oil prices don't help, but it has got low debt loads. It's sitting on sovereign wealth funds that are as rich as they have ever been, right? And so that leads to questions that the Kremlin has had to answer about why not open those funds up and spend a bit more money. Do you have a sense of why the Kremlin has stuck to a degree of austerity in the midst of this?
Well, I think the Kremlin always had a very cautious fiscal policy, right? They try to keep the money they have as long as they can, because it's a sign, it's an element of their sovereignty that I think they consider is very important. So if they consider that the private sector can continue to pay salary, they will try to outsource as much as they can. And I think if you look at their economic policies in the few years, they are really in a neoliberal system of outsourcing as much as they can and having public services paying as less as they can and making everything private or outsourcing everything. So it's really the society that has to take on its shoulder everything, so the state can protect this kind of quite good amount of money they have, because it's perceived as an element of geopolitical sovereignty, and that matters the more for the Kremlin, I think.
Great. Okay, James Nixie, you're up next.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you very much, Sam, and thank you, Madeline and Marlene. Really interesting, and I really appreciated your tour de région on how the countries have dealt with this. So my question is simply that since you've been around all of the countries of the former Soviet Union, looking at how they dealt with COVID, then which do you feel is the most at risk now? Which do you feel is most at risk of slipping from fragility into instability? I mean, I assume it has something to do with how fragile they were before COVID, and COVID is a force multiplier in some respect. But picking on countries, if you will, which have come out of this, which will come out of this particularly badly, and I suppose maybe with a transverse, which will come out of it reasonably well, the winners and losers of COVID, if you like.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think it's difficult to know because, as I said, we are just at the beginning of the crisis. And in fact, a lot will depend on what will be happening in the forthcoming months, right? If things are kind of slowing down before the summer, around the summer, that's one scenario. If things get worse or continue to be bad until the end of the year, which is totally possible because some states will be late in really entering the peak moment, there can be second waves, and so on. So I think the point is really, it's a long-term thing. See that the problems, the stability issue is not now, it's over several months, if not over 1 or 2 years, that we will see which state can and which population can manage and which one cannot. But as you said, I think it's a multiplier effect. So the already weak state will continue to be weak, which means that in Central Asia, for Kyrgyzstan, it will probably be very badly. For Tajikistan also, depending on how they will be managing the crisis. For South Caucasus, for Moldova. It's all countries that have important labor migration, that have remittances that are a big part of their budget. So for all of them, that will be quite difficult. And of course, I think for Russia and Ukraine, it's probably even more political, because there you will have really kind of strategies of deciding for in which direction you want the state and the relationship to the society to be evolving in a more kind of liberal or authoritarian way. I don't want to use that terminology, but I think the stability will be threatened for those who are already weak.
Great. And for the uninitiated, that was James Nixie, head of the Russian Eurasia program at Chatham House. Gulnaz Sharafudin of our own from the Russia Institute wanted to come in briefly on the economic question.
Yes. Hi, everyone. This is Gulnaz. So, yeah, I just wanted to add just a couple of observations. First, pointing out that I've been reading that there are, there is a disagreement between Siluanov and Greff, and that Greff is supporting the, I think there is this a team of technocrats like Sobyanin, but also Greff who are supporting quick measures of economic support, and Siluanov is holding on, and I think both Putin and Siluanov will be holding on exactly because of what Marlene is saying. They know that they are just at the beginning of this, and they know that they better not to use all the funds right at the beginning, but they will have to deal with this crisis in the longer term. And I think so that's the sort of strategic choices which are made. The second point is that as Sam mentioned, there is a lot of sort of resentment that there is no support for private businesses who are expected to pay, and if no one is working, well, how are they going to pay, etc. And I already see some degree of mobilization from various parts of the country. Like in Kaliningrad, I just saw quickly 450 entrepreneurs, предприниматели, signed some collective letter, and this is just one, and then I saw in other everywhere, предприниматели. So I think the way that Moscow is looking at it now is that, okay, the governors have the space to decide what to do with this. And what I'm observing, and I have a lot of observations based on Tatarstan at this point, but it does look to me that a lot of economic activity will be going on. It will be allowed. For example, the construction sector is openly, will continue to work, and all the governors will be assembling lists of enterprises that will keep on working. And despite the measures in many of the, there was the same response from Pskov governor that, okay, we know there is a pandemic going on, but we have to feed our people, so we're going to relax. And there is already a very formal system of propuski and, the paper that you need to have, or SMS, text message that you need to have that permits you to be on the streets. But the trick is that it's sometimes it's quite easy to do. You can, if you are an entrepreneur and you have your own company, you can print that little spravka yourself and have it. So I expect that, while the face of the response will be looking strict and represent, similar to European responses, but in reality, real economic life will be going on, precisely because on the one hand, the government is not unfolding a big economic measures, and on the other hand, and the people have to survive. So just wanted to add that.
If I can add on that, Gulnaz, I think you mentioned an important point, is that the government really bets on the resilience of the population, right? They think that people will be able to manage with less money because they have been able to do that for several years. And so there is this belief that the Russian society is ready, in fact, to take more on its shoulder and to adapt to the situation. And then, as you said, I think there is a high level of informality that will make things continuing functioning, maybe even if technically, officially at the federal level, they are no more. And also an important element that maybe they are taking into consideration is that just the geography of Russia could be helpful, in the sense that you could imagine region being touched at different times. So there would be different waves arriving at different time, which would allow for kind of trying to manage. So it's tough in Moscow, but you can still do things somewhere in Siberia. And then that's what the US was also betting on. I'm not sure it works well, but at least Russia is probably also betting on different level of peak of the pandemics at different time, depending on the regions.
Yeah.
Great. I've got next up, Giorgio Nicolai. I'm sorry, I'm almost sure I pronounced that wrong.
That's no problem. Yeah, my name is Georgiana Nicolai. I'm a recent King's graduate. Thank you so much for the presentation. Part of my question was covered in your response to Ian, but I wanted to ask whether you expect that the pandemic will negatively impact Russia's relationship with China and Russia's relationship with the former Soviet Union states. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. On the relationship with China, I'm not sure. I think China is playing a very complex and ambiguous role now, trying to brand itself as bringing solution and not as being at the origin of the problem. And that's probably a narrative that the Russian authorities are ready to buy so far, because they need so much China on so many things that they are more on the Chinese side that they would be against it. So I'm not sure the relationship with China will be at the kind of the narrative level will be impacted. But on the ground, of course, depending how long the border will be closed and how long it could impact the economic relationship and the arrival of Chinese product to Russia, there could be an impact in some of the Far East region, for example, that will be the most put in difficulties. China is also a key provider of some, strategic materials for the Russian military sector. So that also it's very important for Russia not to get that disrupted. On the relationship between Russia and the country of the region and inside the Eurasian Economic Union, I think that's a big blow. The fact that Russia closed its border, that Russia didn't really help the migrants that were blocked, in Sheremetyevo or at different places who couldn't really go back. I think that will be seen as by the other countries as the sign that this Eurasian Economic Union functions when everything is going well, and when you have a crisis, then everybody is back to its own nation state. But in a sense, as I said, you have the same happening in Europe now. And I think it's a good lesson also to see that how these supranational structures are very fragile when you really have a kind of a change or a crisis of that level, then they don't really function. The case of Belarus is, of course, specific because they don't want to recognize the crisis. So it was all the countries around will maintain close border with Belarus. It was very clearly said also from Lithuania very recently. But for Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, of course, the fact that Russia closed its border and didn't really help them managing migrants, especially for those from Kyrgyzstan, it was seen as a sign that the union is not very functional in terms of crisis.
Okay, Kate Mallinson.
Good afternoon. Yes, I'm also part of Chatham House's Russia and Eurasia programme. Thank you to all three of you for today. It's a really interesting discussion. President Tokayev appears to have won the initial support of the population for his government's rapid and very transparent reaction, but the midterm economic consequences on the population are likely to be significant, particularly as the economy has been double hit by the oil price collapse. And we've already seen sort of unrest in Shymkent. Meanwhile, Nazarbayev has not been seen for over 3.5 weeks since he visited Moscow. And I was wondering how you see the crisis impacting on both the informal and formal leadership of the country.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I think things in Kazakhstan are quite difficult now, and the capacity of the Kazakhstani society to be resilient is also kind of tested, even maybe more than in the case of Russia. And the fact that you have double president, if I may say, makes things more difficult. It creates more tensions because there is still a lot of discussion about what is happening around Nazarbayev, why he's not visible, that he doesn't want to be seen as bringing bad news, or that he's sick, for example. So it's making the regime more fragile because Tokayev is not really perceived as totally empowered in managing the situation. And as you said, the oil prices are really, it's even more important for the moment, the economic impact of the collapse of oil prices on Kazakhstani economy than the results of the pandemics. And the fact that the Kazakhstani economy is now so much linked also to China, all the trade going from China to Europe. So Kazakhstan is really a hub for a lot of Eurasian transcontinental exchanges that really put at risk a lot of the strategy that the Kazakhstani government was trying to develop these last years in trying to move away from the oil and gas rent. So I think that will be very difficult. And because of the presidential changes last year, we know that part of the, let's say, middle classes in the countries are unhappy. You have a rise of urban activism. The protests we had last year, they are still much smaller, much more smaller scale than the protests you may see regularly in Russia. But still for Kazakhstan, it's a big change of atmosphere. And I think that makes the regime really weaker than previously, because they have a combination of elements. And as I said, I think what this pandemic will add one more layer in a long list of elements of crisis that many of these countries are having, both Russia, but Kazakhstan also. And of course, the fact that Nazarbayev didn't really left the presidency and is still around, not really letting Tokayev being seen as a full president is making things much more sensitive in Kazakhstan now politically.
Great. Anna Tan, you're up next.
Hi, I'm Anna. I'm a graduate student at King's College London, and I'm also an editor at Strive at the Department of War Studies. So my question is, why is Europe falling behind cooperating with democratic regimes and the authoritarian ones like China, especially Russia as well? When we look at some European countries and accepting biotechnology and medical aid, when we see that a lot of it has been not really useful, about 80% of it, when European countries receive the aid, and responding and managing this crisis in their respective countries, because we have seen that Asian tigers like Singapore, even though it's semi-democratic, but also South Korea and Taiwan serve as great examples. But Taiwan being forced out of the any sort of discussion with the WHO. There has been some sort of progress since the last sort of slight debacle with a senior advisor in the WHO. But still, there is a chance for the global trend to move towards democracy, because what we see with South Korea and Taiwan is how transparency has been actually effective in public policy implementation, and for largely public health purposes as well, not just for democracy itself. But what we have is the case of the latter, and I'm just wondering whether Europe can still turn this around, because I understand that working together with China is in a way necessary, because we do need to cooperate with Chinese scientists to get to the bottom of this. But in terms of public policy implementation, I think working with democratic nations would be a lot more conducive, but we don't really see Europe having putting some sort of initiative in that.
Yeah, I think maybe Madeleine also will have things to comment at. I think you see now growing in Western Europe, you see growing interest in how South Korea and Singapore manage the crisis, but in a sense it's too late, right, for Europe, because Europe decided not to follow the World Health Organization recommendation about early testing. They don't have the ability to put their population in this kind of very strict compliance mode. So now the damage is already done in Europe. And so now the main point for Europe is to know how to go out from the being confined, from the landlocked. So the point will be to have everything, to the stay-at-home order, that you have everything now in Europe, and the economic impact will be huge. So now the point for European government is to know how they can progressively reopen their country, have people going back to work, and managing the pandemics. And then you will probably you have countries preparing for a second wave, like Germany, who has been quite protected so far, but is getting ready. So I think it's a big lesson for Europe, first because Brussels totally failed in really helping the nation state, and everybody took decision on its own with no coordination, with competition between states inside the European Union. And then it's a big lesson on looking how Asian countries were able to prepare. I must say that also Asian country has learned lessons from the different pandemic crises they had already in the 2000s. So they were well prepared, able to put money on the table, able to take decisions very quickly. And I think what Europeans are learning now is that because of globalization, they don't have any more industry at home. So you have a huge debate now about should we have pharmaceutical industries being relocated in Europe so they are not disrupted when we have a new pandemics. And you also have the impact of neoliberal reform that have been done in the last 30 years in Europe, is that the healthcare system is already very weak. And so the pandemics is just adding one more layer of crisis on the healthcare system that is already very weak. So in a sense, Europe is paying a heavy price because it has a lot of elements that were already dysfunctional, while societies like South Korea and Singapore and Taiwan were better prepared. So that will be one of the big lessons, probably a lesson of humility for Europe.
Great. Sarah Davies, I've got you up next.
Thank you.
Sarah, yes, if you want to text your question, I'll be happy to read it. Meanwhile, if anybody else has questions or
she's asking the question.
Yeah, so I'll just read it out for those who are not seeing the chat. Sarah asks, do you see the pandemic influencing the ongoing conflicts in the FSU? So particularly some of the frozen conflicts, quote unquote, Transnistria, Karabakh, Donbass, but also places like Abkhazia.
Well, I don't know if I'm talking nonstop and Madeline is not, but I'm not sure. I think it's very difficult for the moment to analyze the effect of pandemics on conflict globally. There have been some research being done now on what is happening in the Middle East to see how it's impacting the Syrian conflict, for example. For this kind of de facto state conflict, for the moment, I don't see anything except that it's deteriorating the healthcare situation. There are research done now on what is happening in Donbass and how the pandemic is impacting the healthcare system in Donbass, but it's too early for the moment to say. And as Madeline was saying, we lack so much data that just knowing what is exactly happening in this de facto state is even more difficult to know what is happening globally in the region. So depending on how the crisis is managed, it could have an impact, but I think globally what it will mean is it will just kind of contribute to deteriorate the situation of citizens who are living on the ground, but not really have a kind of political transformative impact.
Yeah, I think to add to that and speaking a little bit more to some of the conflicts in the Caucasus, I think that this is being seen as in some ways it's made the actual conflicts themselves go on the back burner. And it's providing an important opportunity for increased confidence building measures. I know in some of these internationally unrecognized territories, there's been more, a little bit more engagement between the West and some of like Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And so I think it is providing a moment where I think that proper management of the crisis and confidence building measures between countries and engagement could be influential, but we have yet to see how that will play out. So again, like everything else, it depends on what happens in the coming weeks and months.
Indeed. Okay. Barbara asked a question, another question towards geopolitics. So she writes, China's been building influence through the market as well as through expansion. China's been buying property and business shares around the globe, including as far as Brazil. Due to their authoritarian regime, they had a better advantage containing the effect of this crisis, potentially. Obviously, we've had the data issues that we've already discussed. But the question is, now that the West and other countries may be more vulnerable economically, has there been any consideration given to the advantage that China may attempt to take to expand the social and financial power? In other words, if China comes out of this to a certain degree less disrupted than other countries, does that create a structural shift in China's advantage?
Well, probably it's also probably too early to see, but or to guess. But I would say that China has this kind of finding itself in this weird situation, as I said, of being both at the origin of the virus, as sending medical help, and as sending all these or producing all these technological tools that are now needed for controlling the situation and helping or controlling the population and helping manage the forthcoming months of the crisis. So it's probably give China a kind of new role on the international scene. And I think many in the West are kind of looking and worried at that. At the same time, everybody is now managing the emergency and everybody is a kind of urgency mode. So all the discussion you had, for example, just before the crisis in Europe about, do we want to buy G5 technologies from China? What does that mean if we have China taking control of our smartphone communication industries? All this discussion, they are still there in the mind of people, but everybody is so busy managing the crisis, and it will be like that for several months, that I think all this kind of long-term perception of what we have to do to be sure China is not disrupting too much will be put in the back, and the global recession will also be so difficult to manage for especially European countries that I'm not sure they will be able to build any kind of collective response to China. And once again, depending on how the EU is able to manage the crisis and to be vocal and having its own voice as providing solution, I think nation states will just act individually as they can, and they will be weak in trying to resist the growing Chinese influence.
Okay, I want to come in with a question that comes back to something actually that Madeline said at the very beginning, right, when you were identifying early movers, and you mentioned Georgia and Armenia as two countries that were relatively quick to get out ahead of this. And I was thinking about what is it, if anything, right, that determined which countries did get out ahead of this and which sort of lagged behind a bit, right? So if you think sort of structurally, politically in particular, right, you could put politically Ukraine and Moldova sort of in the same group as Georgia and Armenia, and yet in terms of crisis response, they lag behind. Is there any sense of what determines in this part of the world or comparatively what with the speed that a country decides to move with?
So you might have comments, Marlene. My sense for Georgia and Armenia was part of the quick response was a bit of a heightened awareness about the level of risk that they were at, as opposed to maybe Ukraine or Moldova or countries that were sort of following European protocols and procedures at that point. And so I know Armenia, China and Iran are both major trading partners for Armenia. Armenia shared a border, of course, with Iran. And so I think that caused a very heightened level of awareness there in particular, that they were at high risk for spreading the virus. I also think that the new administration was working very hard to try to show that it was being transparent and effective in responding to this crisis. And so I think that caused maybe a heightened speed of response in Armenia in particular. I think that they were quicker to react to the understanding that they were in danger than many of the other countries. That was my sense. I don't know, do you have anything to add, Marlene?
No, I think that's a good point for Armenia. I think the relationship with Iran played a role in realizing that they were at risk. And I think on the contrary, on the other side, it's for Ukraine, the relatively slow movement of the Ukrainian government is reacting is also revealing how it's difficult. Any kind of policy making decision in Ukraine are difficult to make, and therefore when you need to take this kind of decisions that will have an economic impact immediately, that is of course much more difficult to take. And so you have the Ukraine was quite late in taking that. So I think you have a whole range of consideration that explain why some government can decide quickly and some other just need weeks or months to decide just because of their own kind of domestic complexity.
Great. So actually, but coming back on this, the frozen conflict question, one of our PhD students at the Institute, Anna Maria Kish, writes that although Abkhazia is in a difficult situation with a lack of supplies, there is news at least of a couple dozen Abkhaz residents being treated at the hospital across the border in Zubdidi, which of course is reassuring, right? I suppose that's not an entirely new phenomenon, but it's good to know that that is something that is able to go on. It comes back to something you mentioned earlier about confidence building, right? As being an important factor here. Ian, you wanted to come back in with another question about federalism.
Thanks very much, and sorry for trying for another bite at the cherry, but this is a rare opportunity, so I think it's interesting to pursue. I was really struck by what Marlene said about the way in which this crisis is being federalized in Russia, and the responsibility for dealing with it is being sort of pushed out to the regions. I mean, I wondered whether that's, in a sense, a sign of a lack of confidence on the part of Putin that this can be solved. So, the best thing you can do is to get the governors to fail to deal with it, and then fire them and replace them with new ones, claiming that it's not the fault of the federal government that it all went horribly wrong. I mean, is that me being too cynical, or is the reality that, you know, many of these regions are quite impoverished and unlikely to have the resources to be able to deal with this, and they're basically being stuck with an unfeasible task, in the expectation that Putin will then be able to avoid taking the blame for anything that goes wrong?
Yeah, I think there are at least two levels, and maybe Gulnaz, if Gulnaz is still connected, can add on that because she has been following that more closely than we are. I think there is the blame issue, so it's easier if it will be put on governor than if it will be on the federal level. I think there is also a point about the political language, that when you look at the way Russia has been managing the crisis, you can see that in fact they took decision on the ground, even at the federal level or at the regional level, quite rapidly, but they didn't verbalize it, right? They didn't formulate, we are in a time of crisis, be ready, it will be tough, right? So there was a political language that was very nuanced and polished about what they kind of trying to avoid any kind of panic. But if you look at the decisions that were taken, like, for example, hospital need to be ready and prepared, shouldn't take anyone that is not related to the virus, because then when the virus infected people will arrive, hospital will have to manage. So in fact, they took a lot of decisions on the ground, but they never verbalized them as being part of the language of a leadership saying to the population something big is arriving. So I think they have different levels of reason that explain why, in fact, governors have been the one taking decision. But if you follow what has been happening in Europe and in the US, you have really interesting comparison on how at the local level that is the most at ease to react immediately, and the kind of federal level has difficulties taking decision. But if Gulnaz is there, maybe she can add.
Yes, I'm here. Yeah. Yes, I agree that blame shifting is one of the big reasons. I would also add that, I mean, for Putin, I'm sure the whole crisis became a big stressor and a big surprise. And I mean, the evolution of his leadership has been going very much in the direction of becoming a geopolitical, working on foreign policy, geopolitical issues, as opposed to domestic issues. So it was quite natural, given how the system operated, that the government and the regional governors who have been responsible for the social and economic stability in their regions will be ultimately responsible. And so it makes sense both from the political perspective for the leadership, from the perspective of how system operated. And we already see, the weaker governors being replaced, changed. Anyone who could be seen as a burden, who might have been kept just for the April 22nd referendum to be to happen, they are out now in Komi, in Kamchatka, where else, in Nenetsky. So there have been at least 3-4 changes already, and more are expected. But the shift to the regional level governors doesn't mean that the central authorities are not in the game. I think the work is happening with a very clear directives coming from the Ministry of Health and the Prime Minister, and so the lines of authorities are there, and yet the ultimate responsibility for what's happening in the regions and for the decisions, for the main decisions as to which what degree of radicalness in anti-pandemic measures and how to balance these measures with keeping the economy going is on the governors. And of course, the federal control over the governors make it easy for Putin to quickly, shift the blame for those regions where things go wrong.
Yeah, and if I can add just one sentence on what Gulnaz said, I think it was a big surprise for Putin that this crisis suddenly happened to disrupt the kind of political process that was happening with the constitutional reform and the referendum. So he had his own kind of line of looking how March and April will look like, and suddenly it got disrupted. And I think that also explains why the Kremlin has been so slow in producing a language to explain the crisis, because that was just, they had another plan in terms of reform of what should have been happening in March and April. So it took them some time, as you said, also to adapt to this kind of change not to the fact that they were not mastering the agenda anymore.
Yeah. If I can add just one more point, which I think is quite important for everyone interested in Russia to watch out, this sort of very unexpected reconfiguration of the political system and Putin's going to, from very much a front of the debate and policymaking to the shadow is creating very interesting information trends in Russia right now, with a lot of doubt going into thinking about, can the system survive the way it is? Being used to having Putin as the linchpin and having him very much accepted as a representative of the country, of the nation, of the identity, etc. And what's happening now is that he's, in a way, not that he's disappearing completely, but there is a lot of commentary, a lot of doubt, a lot of rumors right now about coup d'etat happening, people really looking closely into how he is addressing the population, whether these might have been, a setup done, both addresses were done from the same time, from the same place. A lot of speculation is going on right now, on the fringes also, but even from people like Gleb Pavlovsky, there was a great piece, actually, if you haven't seen it, znak.com, a lot of very interesting discussion going on as to the huge vulnerabilities being exposed in the larger national political system.
I note that Regina Smith, I think, is also in the room somewhere. I don't know if you want to add anything to this. We have another question on China, follow-up from Barbara, who asked a question earlier, or whose question I read out. Given some rhetoric we've seen out of the White House about punishing China for its role in the present situation that the world finds itself in, is there a danger that if I'm interpreting this correctly, she says, would you say that the market partnership with China will change as a result? What would we expect for U.S. China trade talks? And then I think Regina will come in a minute.
I don't know, because it's always difficult to dissociate what Trump is saying that what will be really happening in terms of trade exchanges. It will really depend also what U.S. firms consider they should be doing. But I can give you the example of the current discussion in Europe, where there are very serious discussion about relocating on the European territory some of the pharmaceutical firms that have been delocalized in China. So I think there will be some impact, at least on that aspect of the market. Clearly, there would be a change of strategies for many European countries. Is considering pharmaceutical element as part of your kind of, at the same level of something related to your military or your strategic element. You want them under your control on your own territory. So probably China will lose part of the market, or this kind of delocalization to China of this sector of the market will be drastically rethought. I don't know how it will impact the US. Maybe that aspect, the pharmaceutical market, will be changed, but I don't know how the whole trade partnership with China will be impacted by that.
Great. Regina from Indiana University, do you want to come in? It's a long line from London to Lincoln.
Okay.
Okay. Wi-Fi issues. Okay. Any other questions while we're giving the Wi-Fi issues a second to sort themselves out, or anything else that you want to mention you haven't had a chance to say yet, Marlene?
No, I think we covered a lot of issues during the discussion.
Okay, well, I'm sure we will come back to this at some point in the not too distant future. We're going to take a break next week at the Russia Institute for the holidays, but we'll be back with some other issues, not just Russia focused. So we'll be looking at Ukrainian politics, and we'll be looking at Russian politics. Obviously, we talked about the referendum or plebiscite or whatever we're calling it now around the constitution that is not going to happen when it was meant to happen, but is going to happen eventually, and all kinds of other interesting stuff going on. So if you haven't had a chance to read Madeline and Marlene's memo, you can find it at ponarzEurasia.org. And I recommend that you do that. Otherwise, please join me in giving our speakers this evening, or whatever time of day it is where you are, a virtual round of applause, or a round of virtual applause. We will hopefully see you all soon. Until then, stay safe, stay sane, and be well.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.